Have you ever walked through the aisle of a grocery store and felt ashamed? That's the way I used to feel going to the grocery store as a little girl. Because I would go to the cereal aisle and I would look at Aunt Jemima pancake mix. And I would feel ashamed because as a little chocolate black girl, I would think that's how the world saw me. As mammy, as subservient, as less than, as here just to help other people. So you can imagine my joy when in the summer of 2020, PepsiCo made the fantastic decision to retire the Aunt Jemima brand of pancakes. But that decision was a long time in coming. It tells me a few things. It tells me that we have to hold corporations accountable for racist products, in general, racism as well. So PepsiCo inherited Aunt Jemima, and when it did so, it knew that it was problematic, but it kept the brand anyways. And this is the same company that proclaimed in the 1980s that apartheid was wrong, and one of the first companies to divest from the apartheid regime. And yet and still, for 20, 30 years, they kept the Aunt Jemima brand. We have to hold corporations accountable for racism. In particular, after the summer of 2020, when Mr. George Floyd was murdered, and all of a sudden corporations woke up, if you will. They came to see there was value in Black Lives Mattering, that there were black squares on Instagram proclaiming as such. But how do we hold corporations accountable for the racism? That is the work of my project. But it's not created in the vacuum, nor is it created in the summer of 2020. It's a continuation of my work called The Religion of Race, where whiteness is sacred and blackness is profane. And the Constitution is that sacred text that's interpreted by the Supreme Court to maintain the ritual of law, to keep whiteness as sacred and blackness as profane. But the work that I do now is bringing that idea into corporate law so that we can hold corporations accountable for racism. And I use the idea and the ideals of the Black church, 3 ideals: reckoning, repentance, and restitution. The first one, reckoning, means we have to acknowledge that there's a problem. Even now, in 2023, there are still conversations of whether or not corporations should be held accountable for racism, or at the very least, diversify so they can impact communities, employees, and other stakeholders. There has to be an acknowledgement of the role that corporations have played in the history of anti-Black, as well as other anti-racists, in the creation and the maintenance of racism in this country. And this centers on the idea of corporate personhood. The Supreme Court, in all their wisdom, has said that corporations are persons, just like you or I. And for that reason, it's important for us to take the Supreme Court at their word. If they are persons that have constitutional rights, I say they have constitutional responsibilities. And that responsibility is to redress for unjust harm and for other value that they've gained from racist practices. So the first step, that being reckoning, means we have to have corporations acknowledge the racism that they've taken part in. The second part, repentance. In the church, repentance means you confess your sin and you turn it around. So we have to have corporations do that. But part of that is knowing their history, their interaction with racism, all the way back from slavery to Jim Crow, mass incarceration, convict leasing, and financial oppression. Part of that is creating a disclosure regime for corporations to really engage with their own history, their own practices, based on different sets of disclosure, whether it's environmental, social, or governance metrics that we currently have, whether it's doing something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that we had in South Africa. But it has to be a way for corporations and for us as society to excavate the role corporations have played in the maintenance of racism in this country. And then they can turn it around, right, after you confess that sin. And thirdly is restitution. It's not enough to acknowledge that there is a racism and to acknowledge one's past interaction with the racism as a corporation, but to also repair the damage that was done, to put whole communities, whether there's Black communities, Asian communities, Latino communities, communities that have been damaged and been oppressed since the beginning of this country's history. So I propose we create metrics and enforcement mechanisms that we, as a society and through law, hold those corporations accountable, such as creating metric systems with the SEC, right? We did that with Sarbanes-Oxley, with Dodd-Frank. After certain key moments in American history, we've asked corporations to step up and to have a higher level of responsibility to people and to shareholders. I suggest we do the same for racism. And part of that is underlying belief put forth by a few others, but particularly Dr. Ibrahim Kendi, that says it's not enough to be not racist, we have to be anti-racist. And we're speaking of humans, and people. Well, corporations are people as well. So let's look at corporations being anti-racist, such as having a veneer over these ESG factors that we currently use to measure the progress of corporations along certain metrics, such as environmental, social, and governance. Let's overlay anti-racism on top of that, so we can interrogate this history of racism, but also holding corporations accountable for the future. For it's not enough to go back in the past, we have to also look forward to the future. I'm animated by the work of Dr. King, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and his work, his last seminal work, Where Do We Go From Here? Right? Chaos or community. Part of Dr. King's argument is that there is racialized capitalism in this country, a way that wealth is not distributed equally amongst all races, right? So I take that as a proposition to say that it is time for us to hold corporations as people responsible for their role, but let's help them be the moral and just beings Dr. King would have them to be. And part of that is doing this work, this interrogation of their past, but also looking at their future so that they can be part of the beloved community as well. And in that way, little boys and girls going forward don't have to worry about going to the grocery store and seeing certain products on the aisle, because then we will all be free.